So our worship theme in February is truth and lies. Truth and lies. And so today in my sermon, I'm going to share some hard truths about our Unitarian Universalist history. Some aspects of our history, of our past, that we don't often talk about. Unitarian Universalism is in general a religious movement that venerates its ancestors, its heroic figures of the past. We are justly proud of the intellectual and cultural luminaries among our number, too many to list, who have made deep contributions to religion and science, philosophy and culture. We are proud of a tradition that has inspired people in every generation to strive for a better world, whether it was those who fought for abolition, for women's suffrage, for prison and mental health reform, for universal public education, for civil rights, for peace, for the freedom of the press and the protection of the environment. Unitarian Universalists have been on the cutting edge of all of those movements throughout our history. I will spare you the lists of famous Unitarians and Universalists. They are easy enough to find on the internet. But the point is, we are justly proud of our heritage and our tradition. We are also selective, as is no surprise, in the parts of our heritage and our tradition we choose to name and own and talk about. Just as one example, we are quick to talk about the Unitarians who fought to end slavery, and we are less eager to talk about the equally many Unitarians who profited off of the slave trade. That's not a surprise. So today we're going to talk about one of those aspects of our history that we would prefer to forget about, that we would rather not claim as our own. And in doing so, I'm going to be naming some people directly, some historical figures. I'm going to be criticizing others by association. So I want to begin by noting that I'm aware that in doing so, I am putting myself in this sort of elevated position and pointing out the faults of past generations from the pulpit. And I do not mean to be indulging in self-righteousness or basking in moral superiority by doing that, right? It is an easy thing to look at the decisions of people now long departed and say, how could they have done such and such, right? How could they have been a party to these injustices, if injustices they were? How could they fail to recognize what we now see as obvious truths? But I am just as sure that my generation is as guilty of as many failings, our own failures to understand and to act, and I do not doubt that some future generation will judge me just as critically, just as incredulously as I may judge others. So I ask that we proceed today in the spirit of humility with the hard truths that I am going to share. And if we ask ourselves, how could they? Let it be only so that we can then turn inward and ask ourselves, how then might we be today? So in 1915, the great Universalist theologian Clarence Skinner wrote in the foreword to his new book called The Social Implications of Universalism, he wrote, "How to transform this old earth into the kingdom of heaven. That's the primal question. For thousands of years, sad-eyed men have looked upon this war-racked and greed-broken world, yearning to gather it into their great healing love." So Skinner, in just a few words, expressed the spirit of a movement that had in his generation captured the imagination of mainline Protestant leaders all across the West, a movement known as the social gospel. And social gospel Christians heard in the words of Jesus and in the example of his life a moral imperative to work to transform the world so that all the evils that had ever plagued humanity could be done away with forever. Poverty and war, cruelty and violence, crime, disease, ignorance, it was all to become an unpleasant memory of a distant age. How to transform this old earth into the kingdom of heaven, that's the primal question that the social gospel Christians were wrestling with. And the achievement of this great aim was not going to be found in saving souls, although saving souls they might, but it was going to be found in reforming society through practical social programs and institutional change. And in the optimistic spirit of that age, the very turn of the 20th century, an optimism buoyed by enormous scientific advances in hygiene and medicine and vaccinations and communication and industry, all of these things that were making the world a better place, it was believed that the attainment of this goal, the kingdom of heaven on earth, was well within our grasp. This was an era of tremendous faith in scientific progress. And sometimes terrible things are done out of a place of tremendous faith. In the book Elite, Uncovering Classism in Unitarian Universalism, author Mark Harris draws our attention to another passage by Skinner in the very same work. And in this passage, Skinner is expressing his optimism that one day soon there would be no more crime. And he writes, "The new enthusiasm for humanity readily pictures a time when through eugenics, education, friendship, play, worship, and work, the criminal will be no more, because the misdirection or the underdevelopment of human nature will cease." So did you catch that one word? Right?
We sure did.
On the one hand, Skinner believes, like a good liberal, that crime is the product of the tragic underdevelopment of the human person, right? And you address it through education and friendship and worship and play and work, right? Through love and reason and knowledge. These are the classic ideas of Unitarianism and Universalism. We have always believed in these great goods. In fact, Unitarians and Universalists have always been at the forefront of spreading public education for that very reason. We believe in the beauty of what happens when you unlock the human mind and the human spirit. And on the other hand, Skinner casually mentions this other way, that criminality will be addressed, and it is not social reform, and it is not moral uplift, it is eugenics. Eugenics. A movement that developed in the early 20th century that foresaw a glorious future that could be achieved through the selective scientific breeding of people. It was based on a number of erroneous scientific ideas. One was that there was a whole panoply of supposedly socially undesirable traits in the language of that era: criminality, promiscuity, laziness, imbecility, perversity, all of these words that they had. That these traits were inborn and biological, they believed. That there was such a thing as being born criminal. The second scientifically erroneous idea is that these traits were passed on in a very simple way through genetic inheritance, right? So if you were born criminal and you had kids, your children were that much more likely equally to have this criminal nature. And so then, if we could encourage these so-called exceptional people to marry and breed, and if we could discourage these so-called unfit and inferior people from breeding, we could breed our way into a better future, where all these things like crime were a distant memory. And the flip side of eugenics, which was born out of the racism of the era and the tremendous anxiety about the influx of immigrants coming from Ireland and Asia and Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, there was this idea that the white, pure, superior Anglo-Saxon racial stock, which had made America so great, was in danger of being diluted by this influx of an inferior foreign stock. Needless to say, this fear was also not based in accurate science, but it was tremendously influential in its day. So the famous Universalist minister Clarence Skinner, in his book, The Social Implications of Universalism, is at least playing with the idea that one day we will establish the kingdom of heaven on earth by discouraging the people that he deems unfit from having children. And in this idea, he was far from alone. Far from alone. Indeed, there was tremendous interest and enthusiasm for the possibilities of eugenics in the 20th century, in the early 20th century. So it's not a surprise that we find Unitarians and Universalists among the enthusiasts, and indeed we do. Take, for example, the great Unitarian minister John Haynes Holmes, one of our most famous ministers. And normally when we talk about John Haynes Holmes, we talk about his pacifism, his conscientious objection to World War I. We talk about his advocacy of economic justice for the working poor. We talk about the way he envisioned churches as democratic, community-centered organizations that would transform communities. We don't often mention, and I didn't know until I researched for this sermon, that he was also an enthusiastic supporter of eugenics. He formed something called the Eugenics Committee for the liberal ministers in New York, and encouraged ministers to only sanction what he called health marriages, which is marriages in which people of appropriate stock would come together and breed and create appropriately healthy children. And Holmes was not unique in this idea. There was a lot of interest in this time at the power of ministers to improve society through the encouragement or discouragement of marriage. And in this regard, Holmes surely believed that he was not only promoting the social good, but the individual happiness of everyone involved. And while on the one hand we might not expect people to be any better than the era that they live in, it's not enough to say that the Unitarians were just no better than the era that they lived in, because in too many cases we find them actually in the vanguard of the eugenics movement. Right? John Haynes Holmes didn't just like the idea of health marriages, he formed a society to promote this idea, and he spread it among all these other ministers. Now, for a worse example, let us look at the epicenter of the eugenics movement in America, which we find, alas, right here in Indiana. So let me digress. Let me digress to say that in learning about the history of eugenics in preparation for this sermon, I want to thank Worship Associate Ryan Robinson. Ryan wrote his master's thesis on this subject, so this is an area of expertise for him. He was very kind to have lunch with me and lay out all of this history and all of these ideas. It was not the most fun lunch I've ever had, but I sincerely appreciate it. And it was Ryan who alerted me to the Indiana connection to eugenics. He gave me a bunch of books. One of these was called A Century of Eugenics, edited by Paul Lombardo. And I have to tell you, it is a bad feeling to open a book called A Century of Eugenics, and the first chapter is called The Hoosier Connection, and the second chapter is called The Indiana Way of Eugenics. The Indiana Way of Eugenics. And it's not just an Indiana connection, it is a Unitarian connection. So the whole sad, sordid history begins with a man named David Starr Jordan. Jordan was a highly educated, highly successful scientist and educator. He was an ichthyologist by training. He became fascinated with modern theories of evolution and what he saw as their social implications. And he was a Unitarian. In fact, he was such a Unitarian that he was named after one of our most famous Unitarians, Thomas Starr King. He shared Unitarian enthusiasms for science and progress. And so in 1902, he wrote a book called The Blood of the Nation, a study of the decay of races through the survival of the unfit, in which he laid out his theory that the very progress of the modern world that we were so happy about was actually allowing the unfit to survive and reproduce, where formerly they might have died from disease or starvation, and this was weakening the genetic stock of the nation. And he wanted to draw our attention to the implications of this. Jordan was an extremely prolific author. Between 1902 and 1916, he published 19 books about these ideas, all of them published under the Unitarian press, Beacon Press, which is still with us today. According to Mark Harris, he became the most sought-after speaker of his day at Unitarian events. He also became president of Indiana University, bringing his ideas here to Indiana. While at IU, he chaired the first committee on eugenics of the American Breeders Association, arguing for the need to remove so-called defectives from breeding. Now, David Starr Jordan's work was theoretical, but it found the ready ear of a physician named Henry Sharp, who was utilizing a new surgical procedure recently invented called the vasectomy, developed at that same Indiana University. And he was using it to sterilize male inmates in prison, in Indiana prisons. And Sharp's work originally was strictly voluntary, done, he believed, for health benefits. But in Jordan's work, and in the work of similar thinkers, Sharp and a number of other people saw a rationale for expanding the scope of their work to promote the greater social good. And so in 1907, Indiana became the first state to pass a law allowing for the compulsory sterilization of criminals and other social undesirables. Henry Sharp, arguing in defense of the practice, said we owe it not only to ourselves but to the future of our race and our nation to see that, in his words, the defective and the diseased do not multiply. Now, the Indiana eugenics law was controversial at home. It was enormously influential across state lines. Some 30 states immediately adopted similar laws in imitation of Indiana. Meanwhile, in Indiana, it was argued over, it went away for a while, it came back with a vengeance in 1927. That same year, 1927, it was a Unitarian Supreme Court Justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who ruled in the famous case Buck versus Bell that compulsory sterilization was constitutional. In his infamous decision, he wrote, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind." One of our most famous Unitarian ministers. There was another Unitarian on the Supreme Court who concurred with Holmes' decision, and this was Chief Justice William Howard Taft. Taft, of course, was the former President of the United States. He was also the former president of the National Council of Unitarian Churches, vice president of the American Unitarian Association, and he was an enthusiastic eugenicist. Mark Harris reports in the lead that Taft had a prominent role in the publication of a booklet called How to Live, which included, among its recommendations for good hygiene and healthy living and a good diet and all this kind of wholesome stuff, a recommendation that every state have a eugenics board with the goal of preventing reproduction by the markedly unfit and the sterilization of what he called gross and hopeless defectives, and the book sold 133,000 copies. And over the course of almost 70 years, under the jurisdiction of various evolving eugenics laws, under the protection of Holmes and Taft's Supreme Court decision, Indiana sterilized around 2,500 Hoosiers compulsorily. The law was not taken off the books in Indiana until 1974. Meanwhile, David Starr Jordan, the famous Unitarian, had long since left IU to become president of Stanford University, and he spread his eugenics movement to California, which took it up with zeal. The New York Times reports in a 2016 article by Mike McFaith that between 1919 and 1952, California's state homes and hospitals sterilized about 20,000 people under eugenics laws that were intended to cure societal ills by halting the procreation of people deemed inferior. And of course, who was deemed inferior was a function of every prejudice that existed in its day. So poor people, the offspring of immigrants, women, people with mental health issues, people of color were more likely to be sterilized than any other. And criminality and promiscuity were most often cited as the justifications for this. And one shocking and tragic consequence of Jordan's work and the work of others like him was that as California became a model for eugenics programs, it attracted the attention of Nazi scientists overseas who came to America to learn from us how a eugenics program might be properly carried out. And they modeled their laws on ours. Now, the popular understanding is that the horror over what the Nazis then did, over the atrocities perpetrated in the name of eugenics, fatally tainted eugenics as a movement forever, and that it was just done. The reality is not that simple. In Indiana, forcible sterilizations actually increased for a time in the aftermath of World War II. Many states retained these laws on their books until the 1970s. Gregory Michael Dorr describes in A Century of Eugenics in America how in Alabama and North Carolina, thousands of black women were targeted for medical sterilization by medical professionals and social workers under the shakiest possible ideas of informed consent, sometimes through outright deception, sometimes through no consent. These practices in the South were so common that they have their own bitter slang term, a Mississippi appendectomy, they called it. But of course, these things did not just happen in the South, nor are they confined to even that recent past. The news broke in 2013 that as recently as 2010, some officials in California had been coercing female prisoners to get sterilizations. In 2015, we learned that Nashville prosecutors were making sterilizations part of plea agreements for female defendants, that they would get reduced time if they would agree to be sterilized. Eugenics began by focusing on the incarcerated, and we see that this vulnerable population is still being targeted. And of course, there is a racial component to who is likely to be incarcerated to begin with, because eugenics has always been caught up in racism, and it still is. Now, it may seem shocking to our modern ears to hear Unitarians and Universalist ministers speaking casually of the so-called unfit and defective. These are not words and concepts that we apply to people, right? On the one hand, though, Unitarians and Universalists at the turn of the century were acting on the basis of values that we still hold dear. A belief that religion was about making a better world, a belief that progress could be achieved and the alleviation of human suffering was the proper goal of religion. And specifically, a belief that these things could be achieved through reason and science and the rational reform of society. Right, one of the sources of our living tradition is humanist teachings that counsel us to respect the dictates of reason and science. And Unitarians and Universalists have always had a deep respect for science. We were the first denomination to embrace the new teachings of evolution. But what the 20th century showed us is that a deep respect for science can all too easily fall into a worship of science, into scientism. We can make an idol of science, forgetting that in all ages our knowledge is incomplete, and we are wise to go slow, to remember our humility, to weigh carefully the consequences of our actions. At times it was our very optimism as Unitarians and Universalists that caused us to rush ahead of our ethical understanding and then to indulge ourselves in the name of progress in pseudoscience that confirmed all of the worst of our assumptions and stereotypes. We made an idol of science, a golden calf out of golden calipers. And in doing so, we lost sight of the human dignity of those whose lives we presumed to improve. And today, we enter a new era of genetic engineering, bioengineering, climate engineering, social engineering through social media. We will be given many, many opportunities to repeat all of these same mistakes. So learning from these lessons, maybe we be wiser and humbler in our own day. And in this regard, modern Unitarian Universalism has had human dignity, the inherent worth and dignity of each person, as one of our core principles in some form or another since we came together in 1961. We think of this among our most fundamental religious commitments that defines who we are. So there has been undisputed ethical progress in our thinking about informed consent and medical ethics. But if we think of eugenics as in some sense a conversation, a larger conversation, about what kinds of bodies matter, we should not be so comfortable about the progress that we have made. In America, there has always been a systematic devaluing of black bodies and bodies with disabilities, and we still live with that today, sometimes directly and sometimes by legacy. Many of our older UU churches, for example, have these majestic elevated pulpits that are totally inaccessible to someone with mobility issues. The Reverend Teresa Soto points out that the congregations who built those exalted pulpits never imagined that someone with a disability might be called forth from their number to lead them. Never imagined such a thing. So the architecture of the church itself communicates a message about what kinds of bodies are valuable and who is expected to serve. Meanwhile, the rash of stories from the past year of white people calling the police on black people just for existing in public spaces says a great deal about which kinds of bodies are expected and valued. Meanwhile, legislation is being written right here in Indiana to deny with the stroke of a pen the reality of transgender bodies in our public schools and our public spaces. These issues of ableism, transphobia, racism sometimes play out in Unitarian Universalist spaces as well. We are not exempt from these issues. In her poem, A Litany for Survival, the poet Audre Lorde speaks of those who live on the margins, on the shorelines, those imprinted with fear from the moment of their birth, those who were intended to be silenced in American history. Those who can say when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. And she counsels defiance. Defiance and daring. She says it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. If we have made progress on issues like racism and disability rights, it is only because of the voices of so many who were never meant to be heard, who were never meant to survive, who lifted their voices anyway. And so, may we lift up the courage of those on the margins throughout our history who have chosen to speak, who have borne witness by whatever means to their own truth and to the worth and beauty of their own being, who have insisted on just and equitable treatment. May we acknowledge our own worth and the worth of others. May we love our own bodies and the bodies of others. May ours today be a religion that sees progress not as the cultivation of certain kinds of bodies, but as the care and protection of all kinds of bodies. And in the face of the worst excesses of our own history, let us raise up a song of hope that love may prevail in heaven and earth, a love that each generation, including our own, understands imperfectly and incompletely, but a love to which we have pledged our whole hearts so that we can justly say never again. May it be so, and amen.